During the Pacific War, relatively few battleships were used in their intended role. Grand surface battles were mostly a thing of the past, but that is not to say they didn't happen. And in today's video, we'll be looking at probably the most famous battleship to participate in one of those. USS Washington, the bane of Kirishima. If you're looking for a battleship-on-battleship action, well, this is one of the best known. Assuming you consider the Congos to be battleships, of course. Washington snuck up to functionally point-blank range before blasting Kirishima to pieces, while the Japanese were rather distracted beating up USS South Dakota. That single action will forever be what Washington is remembered for, but it was by no means the only fighting she got up to. And today, we'll look at the rest of her story as well, from sinking Kirishima to an unfortunate collision, and everything in between. Starting, of course, when the ship was first laid down. That came in more peaceful times on June 14th, 1938. A new battleship was laid down by the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard as part of the modernization of the United States Navy. With the new ship launched on June 1st, 1940, and commissioned on May 15th, 1941, as USS Washington BB-56. In this, she inherited the name of a much less fortunate ship, USS Washington BB-47, the incomplete Colorado-class ship that was a victim of the Washington Naval Treaty. I have a video covering that ship that I'll link in the description. As for this Washington, she was the second member of the North Carolina-class battleships, the first American-fast battleship, and for that matter, the first battleships of the United States Navy since the Colorados. Washington and her sister North Carolina were powerful ships, not perfect, as you could probably expect, but still well-built warships. As initially designed, the ships were intended to displace around 35,000 tons. Sources will differ on the actual tonnage in service, with Conway citing 37,484 tons at standard, and 44,377 when fully loaded, with the full load figure being roughly in line with Freedman's 44,800 tons. Regardless of the exact figure, that displacement allowed for a new weaponry layout. 3 3-gun turrets, a super-firing pair on the bow, and a single turret on the stern. A total of 9 16-inch guns in all. This was a powerful main battery, to say the least. Something that Washington would demonstrate quite well in late 1942. But that comes later. For now, let's move to the secondaries. This consisted of 20 5-inch 38 caliber guns and 10 twin dual-purpose mounts, 5 on either side of the ship, clustered around the amidships superstructure. This would be the standard layout, with some slight differences on both the South Dakota and Iowa classes, with the exception of South Dakota herself. That ship was built as a flagship and sacrificed a pair of 5-inch mounts for that reason. But I digress, the South Dakotas are not the topic of this video. Those 5-inch guns on Washington made up both her secondary battery and her heavy anti-aircraft defense, with lighter anti-aircraft weaponry coming in a few flavors. Initially, this consisted of the infamous quadruple 1.1-inch mount, the Chicago Piano, famously unreliable. Those would be replaced later in the war by the usual swarm of 40mm Bofors and 20mm cannon. Citing Freedman again, the final total was this: 8 twin 20mm mounts plus 63 single and 1 quadruple mount, for a total of 83 20mm barrels, backed up by 15 quadruple Bofors mounts for a total of 60 40mm guns. That wraps up the weaponry, bringing us to armor protection. This consisted of a 12-inch, 305mm main belt, with deck armor coming out to 5 inches. Although this was divided between 3 armored decks, so it wasn't a single 5-inch plate. Regardless, with that, we only have speed left to cover. This came out to around 28 knots on 121,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. Although initially there were issues with vibration that made running at top speed, let's just say, unpleasant. I'll cover this in more detail when I do North Carolina herself, but suffice to say, it required a lot of trial and error to fix those issues. But fixed they were, mostly, so it's time to move back to service history, as that concludes the design details. As mentioned before, USS Washington was commissioned on May 15, 1941. At this point, the Second World War was well underway, at least in Europe. However, war had yet to come to the United States, not directly. So Washington had a few months of peacetime service. Admittedly strained peacetime, where the United States and Germany kept prodding each other. But peacetime nonetheless. In practical terms, that meant sailing up and down the East Coast to work the ship and crew up, while continuing to try and fix those persistent vibration issues, which resulted in the ship being worked on into early 1942 after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the United States into the war. In particular, the issues with the screws saw continued work into February of 1942, with the result that Washington only sailed to war in late March of 1942, specifically March 26th, when she joined USS Wasp along with the cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa in sailing to Britain, the first time an American fast battleship was sent to reinforce the Royal Navy, but not the last. For this time, Washington was needed to help counter Tirpitz while the Royal Navy was preoccupied with the invasion of Madagascar. If Tirpitz were to set sail, Washington would be there to fight her, which is one of the more interesting what-ifs out there, to say the least. Of course, Tirpitz didn't sail, and the most notable thing to happen to Washington during this was her admiral being washed overboard, John W. Wilcox Jr. Exactly how he ended up in the water has never been properly solved, and probably never will be. It's one of the enduring mysteries of the Second World War. In any case, this happened on March 27th, early into her voyage in rough weather. And even after it was discovered that Wilcox was the man who was washed overboard, the task force continued on, arriving in Scapa Flow on March 29th, 1942, where the American ships were put to work training in how to operate with the Royal Navy command structure. This would last until the end of April, at which point they were sent on patrol. The first of these came on April 28th, a mission to scout for German warships ahead of an Arctic convoy, PQ-15 in this case. This should have been uneventful, but it instead involved tragedy. On May 1st, HMS King George V collided with the destroyer HMS Punjabi. This tribal-class ship was cut in two directly ahead of Washington. As if that wasn't bad enough, the destroyer's depth charges went up beneath the battleship. Fortunately for Washington, this only damaged her electrical equipment and caused a small fuel leak. King George V suffered much worse. and of Punjabi's crew, 49 were lost. Washington remained at sea after the incident, only returning to port, this time Iceland, on May 5th, a stopover that lasted until May 15th, at which point the joint force returned to Scapa Flow. During her time in the Scottish anchorage, Washington would be the headquarters of Admiral Harold Stark, and also receive a visit from King George VI on June 7th. The rest of Washington's time in the Atlantic would be largely uneventful. She provided more cover for Arctic convoys, including the ill-fated PQ-17. That convoy's fate is infamous in how it scattered and was picked off by U-boats and aircraft. Regardless, soon after that disaster, Washington was sent home. PQ-17 came at the end of June and the start of July. Washington was sent home on July 14, 1942, arriving at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on July 23rd. She would undergo a refit for Pacific service, which concluded in late August. Washington set off for the Pacific on August 23rd. She would be there by the start of September and receive her new and most famous commander on September 14th. One Rear Admiral Willis Lee, famous as the single best gunnery officer in the Navy and an excellent battleship commander and general. Under Lee's command, Washington set out as part of the escort for USS Hornet, before sailing on to New Caledonia to escort convoys to Guadalcanal. This duty would run through mid-December and saw little actual action, other than the submarine I-15 trying to torpedo her on October 27th. Don't worry, this will change soon enough, specifically on November 15th, 1942. This story began on November 13th when Admiral Lee took Washington, the newly arrived South Dakota, and 4 destroyers to Savo Island. A large Japanese force, a joint bombardment group and transport run, had been sighted. Admiral Lee was moving to block them, something he succeeded at, to say the least. At midnight on November 15, 1942, Washington's radar picked up a target. This turned out to be a powerful Japanese force. The battleship Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, and the light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, along with 9 destroyers. The resulting battle was a chaotic affair. 2 of the 4 American destroyers were sunk outright. Another, Benham, was crippled and scuttled the next day. Only Gwyn survived, and that was with crippling engine damage. Meanwhile, the battleships had polar opposite luck. South Dakota infamously suffered electrical breakdowns. Several of them, actually, including when firing her main battery. In addition, she sailed past the burning wreckage from the American destroyers, backlighting the ship and making her a perfect punching bag for the Japanese gunners. South Dakota suffered quite a bit in this engagement, even if none of her damage was life-threatening. During this portion of the battle, Washington was left largely alone. She had used her secondary battery on the destroyer Ayanami, crippling the ship. Ayanami would later be scuttled by the Japanese. But far and away the most important contribution would be the sinking of Kirishima. This old ship had been battering South Dakota and was oblivious to Washington drawing closer. Admiral Lee held fire until his ship was at functionally point-blank range, as close as 8,400 yards or 7,700 meters. The result would be Kirishima battered into a flaming wreck that would sink that night. I'll link Lundgren's excellent analysis of the damage for those curious on the exact hits that Kirishima suffered. Well, both of his looks at this topic, the original one and a follow-up made with help from Petrel's survey of the wreck. In any event, with Kirishima out of the fight, Washington shifted fire to the Japanese cruisers. She would fail to land any hits, but the same goes for the Japanese. Still, with only one combat-capable ship, Lee made the wise choice to pull back. He had succeeded in sinking a Japanese capital ship and leaving the transports vulnerable to air attack the next day. After this, Washington's career was decidedly more quiet. She would spend early 1943 escorting the carriers and various convoys, with this lasting until April 30th when she set off for Pearl Harbor. Washington arrived on May 8th, where she would spend the next couple months on refit and training, including a new set of propellers that still failed to solve the vibration issue. Washington only returned to the front line early in August, with the ship continuing to train into late October, before in November shifting to carrier escorts once more. This would remain her role into December during the Marshall and Gilbert Islands campaign. She was detached on December 6th, however, with other battleships: North Carolina, Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, and Alabama. This powerful force bombarded the island of Nauru on December 8, 1943. After this, she returned to escort duty for early 1944, along with a stint bombarding Kwajalein on January 30th. Nothing particularly notable until February 1st, 1944, with Washington ramming USS Indiana that night. This was an accident on both ends. Washington in hitting Indiana, and Indiana in cutting across Washington's bow to fuel destroyers. Both ships suffered severe damage. Washington's bow was crumpled up to 60 feet back, while Indiana's side was torn open. Fortunately, both ships survived and would be repaired. Washington received a temporary bow at Pearl Harbor in late February, before docking at Bremerton for proper repair work. This would keep her out of the war until June 1944, just in time to join up with the invasion of the Marianas as it turned out. Washington would bounce between shore bombardments and carrier escort during this, including during the Marianas turkey shoot on June 19th. Washington would suffer no damage during this. Meanwhile, the rest of 1944 would follow generally the same pattern. Washington would escort carriers with the odd break to bombard various islands or continue training, from Peleliu to the Philippines, with the later operation having another popular what-if scenario. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Washington was with Halsey's carriers as they charged north, and when it was apparent that the center force was fighting Taffy 3, Halsey finally detached Lee to turn around and help. Too late, as it turned out, with Kurita escaping. A popular scenario is what if Lee was sent back in time, for admittedly good reason. Perhaps a future video. Regardless, after Leyte Gulf, Washington continued her normal duties. She supported the attacks on Luzon in January, then Iwo Jima in February, and finally Okinawa in April. Through all of this, Washington evaded damage. No kamikazes managed to hit her, with the result that, as far as I can tell, Washington evaded any damage from direct enemy action for her entire service. This is impressive with how much she was in the thick of some very serious battles. Regardless, Washington's combat career came to an end in May 1945, with the ship in refit when Japan surrendered in August. And after some magic carpet runs, the ship was put in reserve on June 27, 1947, where she remained until June 1, 1960, when the old battle wagon was stricken. Washington would be sold for scrapping on May 24th, 1961. A shame, because this is another of those ships that really should have been a museum. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.